Jamin. So the premise of these talks, as we discussed this afternoon, is that Moses, in this final speech to Israel, is not merely trying to reinforce the law, those laws that have already been laid out in Exodus and Leviticus. Rather, his aim is twofold. He's trying to get Israel to keep the law for the next 1,500 years until their Messiah arrives, but he also wants them to recognise that the law can't save them. They need not to look to jots and tittles, but to the principles behind the law for their salvation. Now, Deuteronomy 21 and 22 can seem like a series of random, unrelated, slightly weird, obscure laws perhaps. They're titled various laws because they seem exactly that. A bunch of short, random instructions that don't seem to belong anywhere else in the record. But Deuteronomy 21 and 22 are really, I think, not so much a series of unrelated instructions, but more a series of closely related parables. Parables about us, parables about our true state, and parables about how God saves us through the Lord Jesus Christ. And of course, Israel missed the point of these parables entirely, for the most part, but they are parables that foreshadow the mission of Christ in the Gospel records. So the captive bride. So think about this scenario. It's 1500 BC and you've just been on a victorious campaign against, say, the Edomites. And there's a line of captives being led away to the slave market when suddenly you see her in the line. She's stunning. Long raven hair, long lacquered fingernails, everything you've ever wanted in a woman, I presume. You want to marry her. So you sit down and you read Deuteronomy 21, and it says in verse 12 and 13, "Then thou shalt bring her home to thine house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and shall remain in thy house, and bewail her father and mother a full month." Okay, so you've got to shave her head and trim those fantastic fingernails, and you do that, and she's not quite as attractive as she was before, perhaps. You realise that perhaps you don't want to marry her quite as much as you first thought, but, that can be fixed. She's got a month for her hair to grow back and her nails to grow back. So she lives with you for a month, but she doesn't turn out to be the meek and demure woman that you were hoping for. Instead, she's angry and argumentative. Those Edomite women can be pretty feisty, especially when you've just destroyed their entire village. So by the end of the month, you really can't wait to get her out of your house. And verse 14 says, you've got to let her go. You can't sell her like a slave. You've got to let her go free, which you do with some relief. What becomes of her? Well, that's not your problem. You've followed the law. You've done no more or less than is required of you. Let's fast forward a few thousand years and think of another scenario. It's a cold and rainy Sunday afternoon in 2018, and you're sitting in your lazy boy recliner, reading the Lampstand magazine, when out of the corner of your eye you catch a glimpse of Brother Jamin Wigzell's donkey wandering through your backyard. Now, you know it's Brother Jamin's donkey because, of course, he's painted property of Jamin Wigzell on both sides of it. It's escaped before, and here it is again, wandering astray in your yard. And of course, the Wigzells aren't home. They're off, as they usually are, on a 6-week cruise in the Mediterranean. So what do? You're comfortable. Your magazine article, coincidentally written by Brother Jamin Wigzell, is also engrossing. The house is warm, outside is cold, outside is wet. You don't want to get up, do you? You could easily pretend that you hadn't seen Brother Jamin's donkey and hope that it wanders off into your neighbour's yard and makes it their problem. But you know what the law says in verse 1 of Deuteronomy 22, "Thou shalt not see thy brother's ox or his sheep go astray, and hide thyself from them." And again in verse 3, "Thou mayest not hide thyself." Don't look the other way and pretend you haven't seen it. Don't avoid the responsibility, says Moses. Not only that, verse 2 says that you're obliged, because the Wigzells were away, obviously, to bring the donkey into your warm, comfortable house until they come back and claim it. And so, probably begrudgingly, muttering under your breath perhaps, you follow the law. You put down your magazine, get out of your recliner, and head out into the rain to chase Brother Jamin's donkey. So this is the problem, as we've painted it this evening. Jamin's in trouble, but is not in any position to do anything about it. He doesn't even know he's in trouble because he's off cruising the Mediterranean. You're comfortable, but the law says you have to get up out of your chair and help Brother Jamin out of his trouble. Get out of your comfy recliner, out of your warm house, and bring his recalcitrant donkey into your house and provide for it until the Wiggles return. You're in the position of power, aren't you? You can choose to act, or you can choose not to act. If it wasn't for you, the donkey could be lost forever. And the same with the slave girl, the captive bride. You're the one with the power, aren't you? It seems under the law that you can choose to marry the girl or not marry her. You have the power to accept or reject her. You have the power to save. And that's how the Jews interpreted these laws. The truth, of course, is quite the reverse. The Jews had put themselves in the wrong position in each of these parables, as we may have. You aren't the person who has the power to save the donkey. You are the donkey. You aren't the man with the option of marrying the slave girl. You are the slave girl. The Jews had completely mispositioned themselves in Moses' parables, and perhaps we can be guilty of the same thing. Take the slave girl first. Where does she come from? Well, chapter 21 and verse 10 tells us that she is from the enemies. And we came across this idea in Deuteronomy 20. Romans chapter 5 and verse 10 tells us that we were once the enemies of God, as does Colossians chapter 1 and verse 22. This was once our relationship with God. We were enemies with him. She's described as a captive as well, and we were once captives, weren't we? We too were captives before Christ took pity on us, captives of sin, as 2 Timothy 2 verse 26 and Luke chapter 4 verse 18 tell us. Now this slave girl, she looks all right initially, doesn't she? Long dark hair and nice manicured fingernails. And on the outside, we might have looked pretty respectable once too. She's described as beautiful and desirable in verse 11, on the outside. As are we, or perhaps we think we are, before we learn about God's standards of beauty. But what does the Word of God do? It shaves our head and it pares our nails. It reveals us for who we are in all our ugliness, self-centred sinners. We could have dressed ourselves up nicely, worn a nice shirt and a tie and looked to all the world like fine, upstanding citizens. But does God look at that? God doesn't look at the outside, he looks at the inside. 1 Samuel 16 verse 7, the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. So God cuts away the outward adornments, our lovely hair, our fine fingernails. He cuts away our nice clothes, and we stand there before him, naked. As Deuteronomy 21 verse 13 says, he puts off the raiment of our captivity from off us, and we stand before him. And he doesn't just see us naked, he sees further. He sees right into the thoughts and intents of the heart. He sees what motivates us. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 12, the word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword. It pierces even to the point of dividing asunder between soul and spirit, between the natural and the spiritual. It's the discerner of the thoughts and the intents of the heart, to the point that, in verse 13, there is no creature that is not manifest in his sight, but all things are naked and open unto the eyes of him with whom we have to do. It's hard to physically cut into a body more than cutting off the hair and the fingernails, as close as you could get to dividing asunder between the joints and marrows that we can sort of literally do without actually killing someone. So we stand there in front of God, in front of his Son, and how do we look? Well, we look hideously ugly. Once our selfishness, our malice, our lusts are exposed, once we're seen for who we truly are, we look hideous. So what does God, what does Christ do? He rejects us, of course. There's no way that he could find us desirable. He sends us out of the house. He has no further obligation to help us. No, he doesn't. Despite our hideousness, despite our stripped-bare ugliness, he still wants to marry us. And we know from the images in Ephesians 5 and Revelation 21 that we are the bride of Christ. We are his wife. Despite seeing us for what we really are, he still wants to make us his wife. Romans 5 again, verse 6 and 8. For when we were without strength, like a captured slave girl, Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die. Yet for a good man, some would even dare to die. But we were neither righteous nor good, were we? We were sinners. But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. What about Brother Jamin's donkey? Are we the guy sitting in the comfortable, warm house? No, we are the donkey wandering about, helplessly lost. How's this creature described in Deuteronomy 22 and verse 1? As an ox or a sheep gone astray. Or in verse 4, it's fallen down by the way. And how does Isaiah 53 verse 6 describe us? All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We've turned everyone out of God's way into our own way. 1 Peter 2:25, we were once sheep going astray. We, it's us. We were the lost. We were astray. Now you would have noticed in verse 2 of Deuteronomy 22 that the brother is described as being unknown or not nigh in that verse. And those words, of course, are used to describe us as well before our relationship with God began. We were not known of God in Galatians 4 verse 9. We were afar off in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 13. And who's sitting comfortably in their house with no real obligation to help us, and yet they choose to do so? It's God. It's his Son. They're the householders of the ecclesia. They aren't lost, they aren't in need of salvation, and yet they actively seek those that are. They choose to act when they could just hide their faces from us and leave us to our fate. Luke chapter 19 verse 10. For the Son of Man is come to seek and save that which is lost. Not just donkeys that happen to wander past his lounge room window. The Son of Man is out there, seeking, actively looking for us. Not begrudgingly, as we might do with our neighbour's donkey, but willingly and eagerly. And what does he do when he finds us? Deuteronomy 22 verse 2, he brings us into his own house. His house is the ecclesia. 1 Timothy 3:15, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the ecclesia of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. And here we all are, in the house of God, in his ecclesia, safe and secure, no longer wandering out of the way. The issue the Jews had, of course, was that they couldn't see themselves as captive slave girls. They couldn't see themselves as lost donkeys or sheep that had fallen into a ditch. They were self-confident. They were self-righteous. And there's a danger of us being like that too, but the reality, of course, is far from that. Like the slave girl, our situation was the opposite of self-righteous. Our situation could really only be described as desperate. In that situation, your life is at the whim of the captors. Gone is any support you might have had once from your family or friends, or security from jobs or possessions. All that's left is desperation. And that's how we are before Christ saves us. And the same with the lost donkey or the sheep that's fallen into a ditch. Gone are its sources of food or shelter. It's got no idea where it's going to get its next meal from. It's defenceless against any wild predators, especially if it's fallen into a ditch where it can't move or run. And again, without being found by Christ, our situation is equally desperate. We're in desperate need of salvation. And if we can't see that desperate need that we have, we'll never appreciate the salvation when it arrives. Now, these principles from Deuteronomy 21 and 22 that Moses is trying to teach Israel here are, not surprisingly, reflected in the New Testament, just as we would expect from a God who doesn't change. But before we go to the New Testament, just run your eye over these 2 chapters of Deuteronomy. So we've got in chapter 21, as we've read in verse 10 to 14, we've got a bound, a captive woman. We've got 2 sons, one loved and the other hated in chapter 21 and verse 15 to 17. We've got the ox or the sheep or the ass that's lost or fallen in a ditch at the beginning of chapter 22. We've got things that are lost and things that are sought for and things that are found in chapter 22, verses 2 and 3. We have a mother bird with a hen and her chicks in chapter 22, verse 6 and 7. We've got new buildings being built in chapter 22 and verse 8. And we've got a vineyard with a different type of plant in it in chapter 22 and verse 9. So just keep all those images. We're not going to go into any detail with those ones particularly. Just keep those images in mind. And now come over to Luke chapter 13. So Luke chapter 13 through to chapter 15. And notice the images that are used in these chapters. We've got a woman who's described as bound in chapter 13, verse 11. Behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years and was bowed together and could in no wise lift her up. And she gets loose from her bondage, as Christ describes it in verse 12. We have a parable about 2 sons, one who thought he was loved and the other who thought he was hated in chapter 15, verse 11 to 32, the parable that you'll know well, the prodigal son. We have sheep that are lost in chapter 15, verse 4. We'll talk about them in a minute. Which of you, having 100 sheep, if you lose one of them, doth not leave the 99 and go and seek for the one that's lost? We have oxen and asses in chapter 13, verse 15, who are fallen into pits and need pulling out in chapter 14, verse 5 as well. So both there in chapter 13, verse 15 and chapter 14, verse 5. We've got someone searching for people who have gone out of the way and bringing them into their house in chapter 14 and verse 23. We've got a series of parables about things that are lost and things that are found, all in chapter 15. We've got a hen and her chicks in chapter 13, verse 34. We've got new buildings being built in chapter 14, verse 28. We've got a vineyard with a fig tree in the middle of it in chapter 13 and verse 6. So all the elements of Deuteronomy 21 and 22 are here in these images that Christ uses in Luke chapter 13, 14 and 15. So Christ is building his parables and his miracles from the very same images that Moses used in Deuteronomy 21 and 22. And the lessons that he's trying to teach are exactly the same as well. Take our bound woman. Come back to chapter 13 and verse 11. And behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years and was bowed together and could in no wise lift herself up. So it's like she's tied down in her bowing over. And when Jesus saw her, he called her to him and said unto her, Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. So notice the imagery of being bound by this illness, but being loosed from bonds that Christ refers to. In this miracle, the woman isn't bound as a captive, but bound by sickness. But the principle is exactly the same. Both captivity and sickness are images of what sin does to us. A captive enemy girl in Deuteronomy has become a woman bound by disease in Luke chapter 13. Neither of them have the means to lift themselves up out of their bondage. As verse 11 says, she could in no wise lift herself up. And neither of them have anything to save themselves until Christ does something about it for them. Both of them represent us, bound by sin. And in both instances, the Jews entirely missed the point. They failed to see themselves in the desperate situation the woman was in. Their attitude can be seen in verse 14. And the ruler of the synagogue answered with delight at an amazing miracle? No, with indignation, because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day. And he said unto the people, there are 6 days in which men ought to work, in them therefore come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. The Jews, they saw themselves as being in command of who could be healed and when they could be healed. They saw themselves as the saviours and not the saved. So Christ reminds them about another parable from Moses, the ox and the ass, in verse 15. The Lord then answered him and said, thou hypocrite, doth not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or his ass from the stall and lead him away to watering? Isn't this unnamed woman's salvation more important than that of an ox or an ass? Asked Jesus. Not only do they see her freedom from the bondage of sin as less important than their traditions, they see her salvation as less important than feeding their own animals. They don't get the point. So in chapter 14, he has to remind them again. Have a look at chapter 14, verse 1 and 2. This time it's another man that he heals, this time a man with dropsy, which sort of sounds cute, but it's a painful accumulation of fluid in the limbs. So Jesus heals another desperate person here. And again, they don't see themselves in the position of the sick person. And again, Jesus reminds them of the ox and the ass. Chapter 14, verse 5. And he answered them, saying, which of you shall have an ass or an ox fallen into a pit and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? Now this time it's a direct reference to the words of Moses in Deuteronomy 22. But it's not their neighbour's ox or ass that they are helping out of the pit, it's their own. Which of you, he asks in verse 5. Can they see the point now, perhaps? It's not someone else that needs help. It's not someone else trapped in a pit, bound by illness, captive to sin, and desperate for freedom. It's not someone else, it's them. It's us. And finally, in case anyone still thought it was about rescuing animals, Christ tells the parable of the man that calls the guests into his supper. So the reminder goes out in chapter 14 and verse 17. Come, for all things are now ready. But the invited guests make all sorts of excuses as to why they can't come. So not too dissimilar from the excuses we looked at from Deuteronomy 20 this afternoon. And they make these excuses, covering up their lack of faith. So what does the master of the house, what does Jesus do? In verse 16, he sends his servants out into the streets and the lanes to bring the poor, the people maimed by sin, the people halt and blind. It's not about rescuing donkeys, it's about rescuing people. In verse 23, it's about going out into the highways and the hedges and compelling people into the house of God. We're both of those parties, aren't we? We were out in the highways, lost, out of the way, blind, when Christ sent to bring us into the house. But we can't stay in the house, we can't just remain in our lazy boy recliner. Now we are the servants sent out by the Lord of the house into the highways to gather yet more lost, yet more halt, more blind into his house. Again, if we can't see the desperate situation we were in before Christ found us, crippled by sin, captive to sin, before he freed us and made him part of his bride, made us part of his bride, if we can't see that we were desperately lost, fallen into a pit of sin and death, if we always see these parables as relating to someone else who needs saving, then we're never going to appreciate what a desperate situation we were in. And be thankful to the one who chose to save us out of it. If we can't see that that's what we once were, then we're never going to leave the comfort of the house to gather others into it. So the Pharisees respond in Luke chapter 14 and verse 6. And their response is that they can't answer him. Chapter 14 verse 6. And when they could not answer him again to these things, he puts forth the parable about those who are bidden to the supper. A muted silence greeted the miracle of salvation. And Luke chapter 13 verse 17 really paints a huge contrast. Just after Jesus has healed the bound woman. And when he had said these things, all his adversaries were ashamed. Again, this miracle of salvation greeted by confusion from the Pharisees. But what about those that saw the point? That saw themselves in this saved woman? And all the people rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. A stark contrast. On the face of the Pharisees, shame and confusion. But those that see their own desperate need, those that tasted of salvation, they're not confused. They see a fantastic miracle done and they rejoice. And that's part of what we do too, isn't it? We know that we need salvation. We recognise that Christ has saved us from a desperate situation, from slavery, from being lost, from falling in the pit. And we get together and we rejoice that he has done so. And we continue to rejoice when others who were in the same situation as us are saved as well. And the theme of rejoicing continues through this section of the Scriptures. Luke chapter 15 and verse 5 to 6, for example, at the recovery of the lost sheep. When he hath found it, he layeth it on his shoulders, rejoicing. That's the shepherd's response to our salvation. Christ doesn't save us begrudgingly. He's not loath to get out of his lazy boy recliner and save us. He's not inside hoping that, we'll just pass by and he won't have to get out and help us. He's not inside hoping to avoid seeing us. He's out there looking for us. And when he finds us, he rejoices. And not just him. In verse 6, when he cometh home, he calleth together his friends and his neighbours, saying unto them, rejoice with me. When he cometh home to the ecclesia, here, his house, he calls together his friends and his neighbours, all your brothers and sisters, saying unto them, unto us, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost. And in case we're just still wondering what being lost and then found and what being captive and then married represented, verse 7 tells us, and I say unto you that likewise, joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth. There's no doubt what this all means. It's about sinners repenting. And the result of sinners repenting is joy. Joy, in fact, in heaven. And similarly, the woman that found her lost coin in verse 9, when she hath found it, she calleth her friends, her neighbours together, her brothers and sisters, saying, rejoice with me. I have found the piece which I had lost. And in case we miss the point, in verse 10, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth. And we've got all these images of joy when the prodigal son returns as well. There's music and dancing in verse 25. And there's making merry in verse 29. And so there's these images of joy at that salvation. Yet we've got still the older son there, and his response is anger. Verse 28, and he was angry and would not go in. So we've got, again, two contrasting responses to the joy of salvation, or the act of salvation. On one hand, we've got joy, dancing and music, and on the other hand, we have anger. So here we are together in God's house this evening. We have been saved from slavery, from captivity, from wandering out of the way, from being lost, from falling into a pit. We've all been brought into the house of God. and we rejoice because we have been saved. But we don't just rejoice at our own salvation, do we? We also rejoice in our brother's salvation, our sister's salvation. Psalm 13 verse 5 says, I have trusted in thy mercy. My heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. Let's make that part of our meditations this evening as we praise our God, our Saviour, in prayer and in song, safe in the house of God. Let's have the faith to trust in God's mercy revealed in his Son, our rescuer, our husband, and let us rejoice together in his salvation.